Hello and welcome to this webinar on tips for migrating to .NET 5. In this webinar, I will cover how to migrate a desktop WinForms or WPF application to .NET 5. We will discuss some tips and various tools that are available to help with the migration. My name is Greg Lutz, and I'm the Global Product Manager for Component 1 at Grape City. I have over 13 years of experience working with .NET, specifically UI design. I've worked with pretty much every .NET platform from .NET 1 to WPF to UWP to Blazor, and now .NET 5 Windows applications. You may recognize my name from the many blogs I've written for Grape City over the years or from the various .NET conventions I've attended. In this webinar, we will look at tips to migrate a desktop Windows application to .NET 5. To better understand why you would want to migrate to .NET 5, I will first give a brief overview and benefits of the platform. I will also demonstrate the process of migrating using a couple different tools. I will show the .NET Portability Analyzer tool as well as the Try Convert tools, both of which are developed by Microsoft. For my demonstration, I will use sample applications that use Component 1 controls from Grape City. Before you begin migrating your application, you should first determine why you want to or need to migrate. Consider this as the first tip. Keep in mind that WinForms and WPF are Windows-only frameworks, so migrating your desktop apps to .NET 5 will not make them supported on Linux or Mac operating systems. The reason you would want to migrate is to take advantage of the features and benefits that .NET provides. I will cover some of those on my next slide. Also keep in mind that the .NET framework is not going anywhere. Microsoft has made that clear, so you do not need to migrate. But if you want to innovate and be more scalable across platforms and future-proof, you may decide to port parts of your application, if not the entire thing. Before .NET 5, Microsoft released .NET Core, which is code that can run anywhere. Even if you decide not to port the UI portion of your application, you may consider porting parts of your application to .NET Core or .NET Standard. If you are wondering how all of this is related, let me explain in more detail. .NET 5 is the next evolution of .NET Core. It follows .NET Core 3.1. They're jumping from 3.1 to 5, and you'll see why. Currently, or previously, there were three different versions or frameworks of .NET. .NET Framework, .NET Core, and the Xamarin Mono. Plus, there's this thing called .NET Standard. All of the .NET frameworks are built upon a common .NET Standard runtime. It's like the lowest common denominator. It's essentially a portable class library that supports everything that is common among the main frameworks. What Microsoft is doing is merging all of these together, and this is .NET 5. It unifies .NET development across the web, cloud, mobile, and gaming by providing a single .NET runtime that can be used everywhere. .NET 5 provides a single SDK that will handle all current application models, including desktop frameworks like WinForms and WPF. Since it includes about 50,000 .NET Framework APIs, .NET 5 will be the next step forward for desktop applications built on WinForms and WPF. The latest version of .NET Framework was 4.8, so by naming the next version of .NET 3.1 as .NET 5, it logically follows as the next version for .NET Framework. Microsoft plans to release a new version of .NET every year, with every even number being considered LTS, which means long-term support. Even though .NET 5 is not LTS, this release of .NET 5 is probably the most exciting thing that has happened in the .NET world, especially for desktop development. As a component vendor, we still see a lot of developers and enterprises working with WinForms and WPF, and those platforms matured 10 plus years ago, so there was very little need for Microsoft to do much for them. It wasn't that Microsoft was ignoring those platforms, they just became stable and complete. So Microsoft shifted their focus to newer technologies like mobile and web. Some of the benefits with .NET 5 and reasons why you want to migrate include the scalability. .NET 5 is the future of .NET as it unifies .NET development across the web, cloud, mobile, and gaming by providing a single .NET runtime. By porting your app to .NET 5, it would become more scalable or compatible with other .NET Core-based platforms such as Blazor and ASP.NET. Essentially, your app would be considered more future-proof. You could move an app from the desktop to the web, for example. Even though .NET 5 is not the last version, The future of .NET will all be seamlessly built upon it, which makes it the future of .NET. Also, there are single file applications. You can publish your entire app as a single executable, and you can even include .NET with the app, so users do not need to install any prerequisites. There are also performance improvements with .NET 5. For example, JSON serialization has become more and more common, and .NET 5 makes this faster by about 20%. Socket performance improvement over .NET Core 3.1 is 30% faster. Plus, .NET 5 is also 3 times faster at serializing data like collections and arrays, with zero memory allocation, so your app will run even faster. .NET 5 also includes Windows ARM64 support, as well as some C# improvements for developers. Plus, if you're using third-party controls such as Component 1, you will get access to high DPI support, a noticeable feature with our .NET 5 controls. There's more added with .NET 5, including web and cloud investments that you can read more about from Microsoft. So what about migrating to .NET Core? A common question you might ask yourself is whether it's better to migrate to .NET Core, perhaps as the first step toward .NET 5, or even as the final destination. If you have parts of your application that are not UI-based, such as services, or code that can run anywhere, those would make good candidates to migrate to .NET Core as its final destination. The reason is because .NET Core provides more cross-platform compatibility, so you may be able to use those services on other operating systems or on the web. When it comes to the desktop UI portion of your application, you should just directly migrate that to .NET 5 and skip .NET Core. It would be about the same effort to migrate to .NET 5 versus Core, and you don't really gain any benefit. You will only waste time, because .NET 5 includes everything in .NET Core plus 50,000 APIs from .NET Framework. Now, once you have decided that you will migrate, let's look at the next steps, which include requirements and optional tools to help aid the migration. The only requirement to work with .NET 5 is to make sure you have the latest version of Visual Studio, which is 16.8 or higher, which was released on November 10th, 2020. This includes the .NET 5 Runtime, SDK, and project templates. There are some other helpful tools that aren't required but may help. For example, there's the .NET Portability Analyzer. You could use this to determine if your project will migrate to .NET Core and .NET 5. If your project has potential issues, such as referencing unsupported libraries, the analyzer helps you identify those problems. There's also the Windows Compatibility Pack. This is not really a tool, but rather a set of APIs that are missing in .NET 5 that were in .NET Framework. The Compatibility Pack adds many of those APIs in a .NET-friendly way that may help your Windows Form app become more compatible with .NET 5. I will not demonstrate this during this webinar, so please check it out on Microsoft's documentation, which I'll share at the end. Lastly, Microsoft has created the Try Convert tool. This tool is provided by the .NET team as a way to help convert project files. It will handle a lot of the tedious work that I'm about to show you. Next, let me demonstrate some of these tools and show the manual migration process using only Visual Studio and Component 1 controls. The .NET Portability Analyzer provides a detailed report on which APIs your app is using that won't be supported when you port it to a specific version of .NET. To get started with it, you must download the extension from the Visual Studio Marketplace. You download the extension, which will install as a v6. Then you must close and reopen Visual Studio. Now let me demonstrate how this works on a sample WinForms application with Component 1 WinForms Edition. With Component 1 WinForms Edition, we have hundreds of samples built on .NET 2, .NET 4, .NET 4.5.2, so we have plenty of old samples to test with. Here I'm opening up this old Report Designer demo, and I've already installed the .NET Portability Analyzer in my Visual Studio. It now appears in Visual Studio under my Tools and Options window under .NET Portability Analyzer. Once it's installed, the first step you're going to want to do is configure the settings to your desired target. So for example, it usually starts with .NET 3.1 checked. You're going to want to check .NET 5 to include that. You can also customize the format of your report to be Excel, HTML, JSON, or others. I'm going to select HTML. Then to analyze your entire project, right-click the project and select Analyze Project Portability. This pops up the results, which you can then view your report from. If you were to run any of our .NET 4.5.2 samples, they will all return pretty much 100% portable because we've already updated them. So for this example, I chose specifically an older .NET 4 project so that we can see some more interesting results. As we can see here at the top of the report, this sample is about 91% portable to .NET 5. Then, if I scroll down, I can see which assemblies are not supported. First off, we can see the system.oladb is not supported. Typically, applications reference this assembly for connecting to SQL Server. I believe we have two options now to resolve this. Microsoft has made this available separately on NuGet.org, but the preferred migration solution here is to switch to SQL Client. There shouldn't be any loss in functionality, but some code may need to be rewritten. Also, if we scroll all the way down, we can see some more issues. It looks like everything related to the system.windows.forms.toolbar is not supported in .NET 5. A quick Google search takes me to the Microsoft docs that lists breaking changes for .NET Core and subsequently .NET 5. There are a bunch of controls that are not supported, such as the data grid, the context menu. All of these have newer versions available, and you can see the solution by clicking on it here. So for example, for toolbar, it says that it's no longer supported in .NET Core 3.1 and higher, and I should switch to the tool strip. Now regarding third-party controls, the .NET Portability Analyzer skips them. If you open the Excel report, it lists unresolved assemblies. So here I can see the Component 1 assemblies are unresolved. Already, we have released many .NET 5 versions of our Component 1 assemblies, but not all of them are ported at the time of this video. We plan to complete porting all of the controls by the end of 2021, handling the more popular ones first. You can find the most up-to-date list of these controls in our .NET 5 release blogs. So that's basically the .NET Portability Analyzer. It lets you get a rough idea of how portable your application is. You can use this tool to help determine if your application is a good candidate for migration. From the list in the report, you can see if there will be problems by investigating each item that won't migrate and research if it's supported through a different library. If your solution has multiple projects, you should analyze them one by one. It's easier by following a bottom-up approach. Projects with less dependencies should be migrated to .NET 5 first, followed by the ones that may depend on that. And as I mentioned earlier, projects that do not rely on the UI should be ported to .NET Core or .NET Standard. And here's the link to the Component 1 .NET 5 release blog that I mentioned. It includes our roadmap of which controls will be ported to .NET 5 and when. Next, let me show you the basic steps that would be needed to migrate an application using just Visual Studio. So let's walk through this manual process, with a focus on what you'll need to do to update the Component 1 third-party controls as well. Here we have a WinForms application using FlexGrid. You'll notice that it's referencing some DLLs, specifically c1.win and c1.win.c1FlexGrid. The first step is to create a new folder inside the main solution folder of your .NET Framework project. This will contain the new .NET 5 project. This is basically to avoid conflicts with the bin and obj folders, but it also serves as your backup. Step 2 is to manually create the new .NET 5 project file. In this file, we set the new target framework and assembly name. You could create this file in Notepad or Visual Studio. Step 3 is to copy the compiled and resource files. Compiled files are your code files. You can literally just copy them from one project to the other, or you could just modify the project file to reference the same files from the .NET Framework project. It depends on what you want to do ultimately. If you want to continue multiple build outputs, then it makes sense to reference the files so you only have to edit them in one place. If you are planning to dump the framework version, then you may as well copy the files over. The next step is to add the .NET 5 project to your solution or to a new solution. You can do this through the Add Existing Project menu or by command. Regarding the Component 1 related files, there's one file you no longer need, and that's licenses.licx. The licensing code is one of the .NET Framework APIs that Microsoft did not carry forward with .NET Core and .NET 5. You may have heard or noticed with our 2020 V2 release that we enrolled new licensing that all of our .NET 5 controls must use. Our existing .NET 4 controls and so on have backward compatibility to the old licensing, so you may not have noticed. But basically, the new licensing for .NET 5 is handled at build time in the NuGet build script. Step 5 is to add the component 1 or any other third-party controls to your project. Since .NET 5 uses NuGet packages, you'll need to add them that way, as opposed to the old way of browsing to a DLL. You'll want to pay attention and notice if the names of the packages you install are different from the previous versions. Lastly, depending on if there are any changes to these packages, you'll have to do a mass find and replace in your code to update the namespaces and references to the new libraries. That's basically it. Of course, the more complex your application is, the more steps it will take to copy things, but converting the project is basically changing the target framework and converting the library references to NuGet package references. Lastly, let's look at the Try Convert tool. This tool is provided by the .NET team as a way to help convert project files. It handles a lot of that tedious work that I just showed you by slideshow. Microsoft published this tool on GitHub, so you can work with the source if you like, or you can just install it as a global tool by running from the command terminal .NET tool install -g try-convert. This tool helps migrate older .NET Windows apps to .NET Core or .NET 5. How it works is it loads a given project and evaluates all the properties and items in the project file. It then replaces the project file with a new one based on the .NET 5 template. It also does a second evaluation in the same project folder so that items that are automatically picked up by globbing will be known as well. It then applies rules about well-known properties and items, finally producing a difference of the two states to identify properties and items that can be removed. As I just mentioned, Microsoft published this tool on GitHub, so you can work with the source if you'd like, or you can install this tool as a global tool by running it from a command terminal. To begin using try-convert, type -help so you can see all of the commands. Next, let me show you how to use the tool, as we'll convert another sample application to .NET 5. So to show this, I'm going to work with one of our .NET 4.5.2 FlexGrid samples and convert that. So I've opened up here the installed samples for FlexGrid. I'm going to go down and find the one that I plan to show, which is our showcase sample. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to copy and make a backup of it. I mean, if you're working with source control, that probably is good enough. But in my case, I'm going to make a backup. I'm going to keep the original sample. I'm going to name the new one FlexGrid Showcase Convert. And in Visual Studio here, let's go ahead and open up the original and let's just run it and see what we're dealing with. Okay, so we have a FlexGrid sample here. It's referencing several Component 1 third-party libraries. We have one form. Let's go ahead and run this and see what it looks like. Okay, so this is our .NET 4.5.2 FlexGrid sample application. All right. The next step I want to do is I want to actually run the try-convert tool on this project and convert it to a .NET 5 project. So I'm going to open up the command prompt and I'm going to use, you can type in try-convert /help to get all of the instructions. So I'm basically going to follow this p project parameter here. And we're going to put in the path to our showcase sample, the convert path to the new project. I'm going to hit enter. So it does give some little warning here about the app config file, but it does say conversion complete. All right, so now let's go ahead here and let's open up a new instance of Visual Studio. And I'm going to open up this new project that I just converted. Now, as soon as you open this up, it's not going to work as we would expect. There's going to be errors. But the first thing I want to do is I want to check out the project settings, and we will see that, we have a .NET 5 Windows application. So the try-convert tool at least converted the project file. Everything else from here on out has to be a manual step. So right away you can see that all of the references to our third-party controls are missing. So here's what we need to do. We need to either replace these with NuGet packages using the .NET 5 versions supplied by the vendor. So in this case, I'm going to replace all of these Component 1 libraries with Component 1 .NET 5 versions of these. And I'm going to go ahead and use them as NuGet packages in my new project. So I'm going to right-click on the packages here, and I can browse on NuGet.org and find all of the .NET 5 NuGet packages for these. If you install the Component 1 controls from the website, you can also use a local repository on your machine. So let's start with FlexGrid. So one thing that Component 1 did was we removed the C1 prefix on a lot of these as we work toward bringing all the platforms together with a common naming scheme. So now the new naming scheme is c1.platform.library name. So here I found the FlexGrid version 5. This is the .NET 5 version. I'm going to go ahead and install this FlexGrid. Now this will also bring in the c1.win, the common library. Accept the licensing. Okay, FlexGrid is installed. Let's move to the next one. Let's do the ribbon. Here we have the .NET 5 ribbon. Now the ribbon control, we actually released a new ribbon control earlier this year that already had the namespace change. So if you've already migrated to the .NET 4.5 version of that ribbon, you'll be good there. Now let's bring in the command. Now some of these libraries, depending on when you're migrating, some of these might only be available as a pre-release at the moment. So you'll want to make sure to check the include pre-release if you're migrating shortly after the time of the recording of this video. So at the time, the command library is a beta package, but we can go ahead and use that. Same thing for the input library. It's also a beta package. And last but not least, the themes. The themes is actually not a beta, but the themes will give us the zip as well. So themes depends on C1 zip, which we need. So C1.C1zip is now replaced by C1.zip. And it's actually a .NET standard library. It's not .NET 5. All right, so there we go. I have all of the packages now replaced. So what I can do now is I can go ahead and remove all of these broken references so that hopefully my project will then build. But before I go ahead and build that, I already expect that we're going to have some problems with our code behind due to these namespace changes. So let's jump over to the code. Nothing in the .NET framework itself that needs to be modified, but the Component 1 namespaces that you just saw me replace, you notice that the C1 prefix was dropped on a lot of these. So what I need to do is I need to run through my code and do a find replace and remove the old namespaces. So I have my code behind there. All right, that's looking good. I also want to go to the designer code behind. And you could just do a quick find and replace on these to make sure that you get every instance of the old namespaces being removed. All right, it looks like I got one more right here. Okay, looks like I got them all. So let's go ahead and now run this application, or build it at least, and see if it works. And as expected, it still does not work. It looks like we have the licenses file to deal with. And that's another important thing to point out, is that with .NET 5, we no longer need the licenses.lacx file. So I can just go ahead and delete this completely. So we have more resources out there on how this works now, but the licensing has now been changed with .NET 5, that you no longer need the licenses.lacx file. The licensing will be handled at build time in the NuGet packages. So now that I've removed that, I should be able to build and run this application. Let's see. And there we have it. We now have that same .NET 4.5 2 sample now running as a .NET 5 Windows application. So to recap, try-convert will handle converting the project file for you. You need to manually update all third-party libraries to the .NET 5 versions. For Component 1 library specifically, the steps to migrate are find and replace the namespaces, like c1win.c1flexgrid to c1.win.flexgrid. Also, you can remove the licenses.lacx file to use the new licensing that depends on NuGet build scripts. Also, keep in mind that this process to update third-party libraries is the same whether you use the try converter or if you manually update the project file as I demonstrated earlier. That wraps up this webinar on migrating to .NET 5. Thank you for watching. Here are 2 key resources for you to check out. The Microsoft documentation has a lot of the same content that I just shared with you. If you are using Component 1 controls and looking to migrate to .NET 5, check out our release blog for more details.